Greetings and welcome to another episode of Kapoto 360 podcast, where we discuss issues to do with transparency and accountability in Zimbabwe's public finance management. Today we'll be paying particular attention to transparency and accountability in education financing. And to discuss this topic today, I am joined by the Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union of Zimbabwe's president, Obert Masarure, a seasoned labor leader, a former student activist. Comrade Obert, please meet the viewers.
Thank you so much, Comrade Liam, for inviting me to this important discussion. Greetings, viewers.
Thank you very much. So, Comrade Obert, to get into the matter, issues to do with transparency and accountability in Zimbabwe's public management have been a topical discussion since the inception of the Second Republic in 2017. And it has affected all sections of Zimbabwe's population differently. So today we want to get a general overview of how you in the labor and the public education sector feel the impacts of corruption, as well as how you deem issues around transparency and accountability.
Okay, thank you so much. I think to begin with, we seem to be a nation that continues to lose a lot of resources because of corruption and mismanagement of the little resources that we have as a nation. You realize that if you come to our sector, to the education sector, you would expect that when funds are dispersed, to say these are the funds that are available from the national fiscus to help our education, then we have to fully utilize them and then we can get results out of them. So you'll be shocked that the little resources that we get, we fail to utilize them. When we check on the budget from in July 2022, we had just spent 44% of what we received from Treasury. What that means is we have a crisis of underutilizing the little resources that we have. But if you go to into the institutions of learning, you'll find that there are gaps that need funding, but the ministry is failing to utilize. But that's a big issue when it comes to the management of public finances. Where are the barriers? What are the hindrances? What is stopping them from utilizing the resources? Then if you dig deeper, you go to their procurement processes, you realize that they are designed more to ensure that other people benefit from them, not that services are delivered. So at the end of the day, resources that are meant to benefit people, the bulk of them do not get to the people. We don't have much confidence in how the public finances are managed because, for example, in education, you would expect that Zimbabwe is a signatory, for example, to the Dakar Declaration, which says maybe every nation should allocate 20% of its national budget towards education. But if you look over the years, from 2016 we had 20% towards education, but that figure has been dropping drastically under the new dispensation. Just this year, the allocation towards education was just 12.8%. And it's not only a drop in percentage share, but even the amount of money that is now being allocated towards education. We used to get as high as $1 billion for education, but now we get as little as $600 million for education. So when we are managing our finances, we are seeing what are the priorities. Why nations agreed at 20%? It was agreed that at least with 20% of whatever you have, you can be able to sustain the education of a nation. But then slashing it from 20% to 12.8%, without any justification, then it's a serious challenge with regards to our public finances. You find other sectors get to spend more that was not money that was never budgeted for. Or the office of the president is notorious for spending money that is never allocated for them, for example. Where do they get the money from? Then other ministries like our ministry get very little and even spend less than what they are allocated. And if you engage them, they'll tell you that the ministry takes time to disburse funds to them. So the way our finances are managed, it seems as if the louder the ministry or the bigger the muscle for the ministry, the more they get the resources. Because you don't see the Ministry of Defense struggling to utilize their money. They get it, they spend more than. Already in July, they had spent almost 100% of their annual budget.
6 months within the year.
Within the year, they had already spent 100% of the budget. We are struggling to get to the 50% mark, but they are already over 100%. But they will still have money to go through the year. So at the end of the day, we seem to have finances being directed towards maybe ministries that are deemed to be help to preserve power for the incumbent, not to other sectors, for example, social service delivery. Because the challenge is not only to education. You go to healthcare, I think they've spent less than 30% up to July. You go to higher education, it's also around 44% or so. So, but if you go to the other ministries, security ministry, related ministries, they get their money much easily.
Then you have actually illuminated a lot of issues that are around public finance management, especially in line with budgetary allocations. You spoke of political intrusion, the executive. You've also spoke of issues to do with, I think, misdisbursement, and you spoke of extravagance. And speaking of extravagance and dishonest procurement procedures, what's the situation like in the education sector, especially now that the government promised to build, was it 34 schools?
Yeah, so we have a government which promised to build 35 schools this year. I think they set around 4.4 billion around that local currency to build about 35 schools. We've been trying to follow up to say, where are the 35 schools now? We want to see the schools and make a follow, but you can't identify the schools that have been built. Then they've also said from the IMF allocation, we have the special withdrawing rights. They said the allocation is going towards infrastructure development in schools, to build new schools. You report that Zimbabwe has a shortage, according to the 2016 mapping, of 2,056 schools. Which maybe, if you're going to break down the figure, we need classroom for the infant classes of 4,800 or so schools. For the secondary, for the junior classes, we need up to 7,911 classrooms to be built. For the secondary, again, we need 2,056 schools classrooms, not schools, classrooms to be built. So we were hoping that with this IMF money that we were promised for infrastructure development, we're going to try to bridge that gap and try to construct. But unfortunately now, we had the Minister of Higher and Tertiary Education announcing recently in Bulawayo that the responsibility to build new schools is now for the new graduates. So the state seems not to be following up on its earlier promises to be embarking on infrastructure development. So at the end of the day, how then we are affected also. So before I go to the next point, I also wanted to speak to the example of Sanitary way. You know that in our budget, we received a significant chunk for our girls to get Sanitary way. We were targeting 80% of the girl child to access the Sanitary way from the national fiscus. So if we are going to be calculating using girls from grade 7 to A level, each individual was supposed to get money in the region of 13 to 16 US dollars for their annual provisions for Sanitary way. But you're going to interview these girls in these rural schools, the teachers, there is no Sanitary way in those schools. But this was going to make a very huge difference. Imagine every girl child having at least $16 a year for Sanitary way. This was going to assist us in a big way to deal with the issue of learners who are dropping out because they are embarrassed to be in school. But because those resources are not being dispersed, that's a serious challenge. But also, let's look at also the oversight role of Parliament in this process. We have been trying to make a follow-up with Parliament, particularly the Ministry, the Portfolio Committee of Primary and Secondary Education, to say what is the position on how this money is being spent. They seem to have limited access because the engagements we have had with them, they have very little knowledge on how this money is spent. But this is a Parliament that is supposed to be playing an oversight role over the executive. But also, then you notice that at times we even the nation borrows without the approval of Parliament itself.
True, yeah.
So, for example, we recently, I was trying to follow up how we borrowed the money from Obert to build some 17 schools that we built, yes. Which were built very expensive schools. I don't know why we spend a lot of money on building those schools, because I was trying to compare with a school that was built by the Japanese in Zimbabwe, which costed them around 100,000. But our schools cost way much than that. But from a loan which we tried to follow up to say, okay, was this loan really approved by Parliament? We realized there was no approval of sort, but it was just a process of the executive engaging the OPEC group and getting a loan to build ridiculously expensive schools. So at the end of the day, you realize that even our borrowing is not very much responsible, which is going to leave the future generation with a debt burden. But also, are we also handling our natural resources to also ensure that the little that we get to our people? You realize that if you go to the mining sector, your diamonds. Right, you see, there is very opaque. You ask, even Parliament doesn't know how much do we really get from the diamond. The royalties that trickle in are very little compared to the potential of the diamond reserves. If you go to our platinum mining, we were scared to hear the Minister of Finance proposing to suspend payment of royalties from platinum. But already we know that platinum, there's a lot of, we are making big losses in platinum because they are not processing it here. They are carrying a lot of minerals out of this country. But for years, we have been told that they are going to move toward the refinery, but they failed. So the other crisis really in public finance management that we are facing at the moment is that we have individuals who are using their positions of power to make deals that do not benefit the people, but for their own pockets. Because no sane person representing public interest can think of a tax holiday for a platinum mining firm at a time where that firm is already shortchanging us because they are not processing here. They're carrying most of our minerals unaccounted for. So I think that is a challenge where our public officials are no longer doing duty for the nation, but they are doing duty for their pockets.
So it's a matter of how we are moving from pro-people or pro-poor governance to more of like crony-based means of governing.
Yeah.
But then also again, one another dimension of this conversation is labor. Yes, you are teachers, you also have an interest in the education, but also again you have a direct material interest in labor. What's your general perception around public finance management as labor, especially from your salaries, your welfare benefits, and we are also looking again at the CMAS ordeal?
Yeah, I think we let's look at it at three levels. Let's begin with how the laws are so much skewed against us. So you would expect that when they are managing finances with regard to our welfare, whatever they get to us is a product of collective bargaining, because modern labor relations entails that an employer, when they give to the employees, it's not an act of charity. It should be a process of negotiation. But at the moment, we don't have a legislated framework for genuine collective bargaining. So you see that we use archaic laws which are not even in sync with the new constitution. For example, we will use our statutory instrument 141 of 1997, which placed the employee at a position of begging the employer. So what we only have is power to beg. So what we get then from the national cake is not what we deserve, but what the employer feels like giving us. So because we don't have the power. So the laws again then deny us our rights. For example, we have the rights in the constitution, for example, the right to collective bargaining. We also have the right to engage in collective job actions, because that's the normal way. That is the only muscle that we have as labor to engage in collective job actions, to demand our fair share of the national cake. But then the law is also, there's also an ancillary law which is against the constitution, but which is being used where collective job actions are criminalized, and we have seen how people have been affected whenever they've been engaging in collective job actions. So the law really is so much against us. But then you look at the administrative conduct. You know, it's unheard of for an employer in the 21st century to go to your salary and reduce it maybe from $540 to $100 without any justification. This is what happened to us. There is no justification whatsoever. There is no discussion with anyone, but we are just told that your salary is no longer going to be $540, but we are taking it down to $100. But we agreed at some platform that we are now being paid $500. We'd expect that when they are reviewing your salary, they should be increasing. So that kind of administrative conduct, which is informed by the police attitude of austerity, where austerity really would entail that they are cutting public expenditure. There's cutting public expenditure, but at the end of the day, you want to cut your expenditure on your education, on your health care. How then, what is your sustainability plan? How then do you intend to grow the economy? That becomes a serious issue. So because of that austerity attitude, we have seen our salaries being slashed to the paltry salaries that the civil servants are now earning. But also there is a general cultural practice that is now in place with regards to our labor relations when it comes to public finances. We now have this crisis where the politicians want to treat the payment of salaries as an act of charity. So you are told that the president has decided to award civil servants $100. Where on earth does that happen? Where just one person sitting somewhere under a tree? It appears as if that president is taking the $100 from his pocket and saying, "No, this is your 100." But we know these are national coffers. We know these are public resources. Where on earth do we have a national president just deciding that I want to give teachers an extra $100? Then the other time, when you are negotiating, trying to push to a better, said, "No, we will ask the president." I don't know. The president has said that he doesn't have money at the moment. We can't run a country like that. So I'm referring to this as a practice which is within the classroom. So we have a tendency of politicizing civil service, because I'm coming from the civil service. So we have politicized it to the extent that the office of the president at some point is handling public service, the Public Service Commission in the office of the president. So that is a challenge now where the president wants to see his hand all over the place. And because of that, we have these challenges. You look at what is happening in Pismas. Pismas is supposed to be a society for the civil servants. But now, government, the only role for government in Pismas was to say, is to improve the working conditions of our employees. We contribute 80% of your subscriptions. So the worker then contributes 20%. It's not an act of charity. It is a proper labor relations where the employer is saying, I'm contributing towards your medical aid. But this is supposed to be a medical aid run as a society for non-profit, run by the workers themselves. So if you read the constitution for Pismas, it will then tell you that there's need for an annual general meeting where the members come together and make decisions on how Pismas is supposed to be run. But that AGM now, the state for 3 years have been blocking the hosting or the convening of the annual general meeting. So where are the decisions being made now? We are told the decisions are now being made elsewhere, and there is a spirited effort to hijack Pismas from the workers and put it in the pocket of the employer. So now we are told even the vice president is involved with the Minister of Health trying to make maneuvers to block the convening of a proper annual general meeting so that the workers themselves make decisions for themselves. But why the other reason why board like Pismas are failing is because when you underpay the teacher, they do not have fiscal space to also contribute substantially to Pismas. So they can only contribute the paltry $2 because they are also underpaid. Right? So if you want to rescue Pismas, for example, then you have to pay the teacher a living wage, then retain the management of Pismas to the workers themselves, who are the owners of the society. Then the government should not obviously be involved in managing those resources. Whenever they've laid their fingers on anything, the next headline is corruption. So George Charambo will come and say, the money that I stole is too little. It could it would not have destroyed Pismas. But you are looting. These are public resources, and you're acknowledging that you stole the money, and you are not prosecuted. There's no arrest. So at the end of the day, we are looking at the role of ZAC to say, now, we have people who are engaged in these corrupt deals, and they are arrested and released. You see of late, when they chose to arrest Wajajena, now the commissioners are now the ones who are now being investigated for having tried to deal with corruption. So at the end of the day, we will continue to have these leakages, and as labor, we will continue to suffer if these leakages are there. So you then hear people complaining about sanctions. I think the real sanctions that we have at the moment are from the executive, the way they are managing our finances. They are appropriating national wealth for private gain, and that has affected us in labor, and that has affected education.
Okay, so you had policy dialogues with the parliament. We followed through on social media, and we even followed through the latest news feed that you gave. And then we understand that you presented a budget brief, an education budget brief to the MPs. So what were parcel of your propositions to remedy issues to do with public finance management in the education sector?
Okay. So I think in the budget brief, really, we were looking at the 6 programs that are being funded in the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education.
Yes.
So the 6 programs, we have the policy and administration, we have the innovation and research, you have the learner support, then you have your infant education, your junior education, and your secondary education, to say how much resources are being allocated to these particular components, and are they enough. So you realize that 75% of the budget for education is going towards salaries. Now, this is suffocating other areas. But if you look at the 75%, it's still paltry. But this is emanating from how the cake itself is very small. That is why we are pushing our biggest proposal is to say, let's have 20% of the national budget going towards education. Now, but then we say, even if it's 20%, it's not going to be enough given the gaps that we have. For example, if you look at the CAPEX, which is capital expenditure, we need a lot of resources for capital expenditure. At the moment, we have very little towards capital expenditure, but we have a very big gap of infrastructure which is needed. So what we are proposing then is to say, why don't we set up an education equalization fund? Because when we are discussing public finances, we also have to look at equalizing opportunities of accessing resources. You will realize that the funding of education at the moment is mainly being done by parents.
Yes.
The government is playing a very little role, very small role. So now when we are saying, then when you look at the figures, parents in what we call P1 schools, the urban schools, the former Group A schools, they are spending up to over 435% more on one learner compared to a parent in a P3 school, those rural schools. So this very big gap can only be addressed if government comes in and use public finances to bridge the inequality gap. So the over 435% gap is worse than what was there when they were whites. Was we were complaining that the bulk of the national resources are benefiting white people, the black majority are not benefiting. But now if you look at the 435% gap that is there between a rural school and an urban school, that those who are planning with our finances should then come in and say, we want to bridge this gap, a deliberate policy framework. And there was a deliberate policy framework that was proposed by Nzira Masanga and the Nzira Masanga Commission report, where they are now saying we need an education equalization fund. Where does the education equalization fund get its resources from? We have a lot of resources that are already scattered around. For example, I will give you examples. You have Potras collecting money from you, from me, to deal with infrastructure development with regards to access to the internet. Where is that money going? So some of the resources should be poured towards an education equalization fund so that we can equalize access to the internet, for example. We have a lot of resources maybe for electricity, where when you pay your electricity bills, there's something towards raw electrification. Part of it should also go towards education equalization, because with electricity you equalize learning opportunities. But we can also have other levies, especially from those who are extracting our mineral wealth, to say what is a levy that we can push towards education in Zimbabwe to equalize access to education in Zimbabwe. But also you can also look externally. We have received calls from the diaspora who are saying, how do we contribute to build schools in Zimbabwe? But if we had an education equalization fund, we can even harness those resources to come through. But now the challenge is of corruption. No one then trusted this fund to be run by government. So we have proposed that with such a fund should be run, for example, by civic society organization, for example, an education coalition in Zimbabwe, can handle those funds well. Then everyone will have confidence to contribute. And we can even have other donor agencies contributing towards equalizing learning opportunities. But then again, when we are still discussing the issue of equalizing learning opportunities, you understand that our government would say, this is the discussion that we also have with parliamentarians. Government will say we have the basic education access module, BEAM. They will say we want to support 1.5 million learners in one calendar year. But the resources they disperse, if each learner is going to get money, we were making the calculation, each learner is going to get around 900 RTGS per term as the BEAM support. That is less than $1. So if your government is saying we want to contribute towards enhancing access to education for the marginalized communities, then you give them less than $1 for them to pay as school fees. Then you are not doing any justice to the agenda. So we agreed with Parliament that the BEAM facility should be scrapped. We don't need BEAM. Why? For two reasons. One, the legal framework in Zimbabwe with regards to education now mandates the state to fully fund basic education. So BIM in its own way is not for state-funded education. It is just to target a small group who are said to be vulnerable. But we are saying we now have a legal framework which mandates government to carry the burden of funding education. So we don't need BIM. We need to fund education for everyone. But then secondly, we are also saying if BIM is for vulnerable learners, who is not vulnerable in Zimbabwe? In a nation where over 80% of our people are living in poverty. So we are saying let's scrape off BIM. This is the discussion we have with parliamentarians. And then let's say, let's just have a grant system where each individual schools receives a grant from government. And now these grants now would differ because you understand our classes of schools. We have your P1, S1, which are your elite schools, your P2, S2, which maybe are your schools in the high density suburbs. Then you have your S3s, P3s, which are the schools in the marginalized communities, rural areas. So when you are now giving a grant to each school, it's given according to the scale of need to say, these ones, at least the parents can pay, we give them so much. This category will give them so much. In that category, we give them so much. Then we can be able to equalize learning opportunities. So we are looking at an area of issues. Of course, the welfare of the teachers also was this big discussion with the parliamentarians, where we agree that the teachers at least are not being greedy. They are demanding just an around of $540. I think it's just enough to buy the basics. It doesn't even cover much of for education and other stuff. But if teachers are comfortable with that, just 540, let's give them that. Look at the SADC average, teachers are earning around 600. So we can be able to do with around 500. Then we're also looking at more on learner support to say learners are collapsing in the classroom. In Matebele South, we are receiving reports of learners collapsing in the classroom. And the ministry confirms. So the Deputy Minister Moyo was saying, no, we know we are aware of those situations. But how are we going to use our public finances to address that gap? Then we are saying, obviously, we should allocate more towards our schools feeding program, which was underfunded in the last budget, and we need more funding. So but then also the issue of rural teachers, we are also proposing that if someone is going to sacrifice and be working in those rural schools, why don't we put forward a rural retention and attraction allowance for those teachers in the rural schools, so that we also attract the best teachers to teach learners in the marginalized communities? If that becomes 100% of basic salary, you find a scenario like what is happening in Mexico, where teachers are stampeding to go and teach in the rural schools because they know that they will be compensated for the hard work they are doing in such marginalized communities. But we are also emphasizing the issue of effective utilization of resources if they are allocated. Let's say the money comes. We need to have Parliament, we urged in Parliament to have a serious discussion with the Minister of Primary and Secondary Education and try to identify the barriers which makes it impossible for them to spend the money. Let's look, these people can get money for funding the implementation of the new curriculum. They fail to implement the treasury requires the money. But you go to the schools, what is the book learner ratio because of the new curriculum? There's one textbook which is just being used by the teacher. So one book for up to 180 learners. So the gaps are there. Then the Home Ministry fails to utilize the resources. So we had a serious discussion around that to say what are the interventions that have to be made. But we also, most importantly, then to say the salary component should be big, but we should find ways of ensuring that it is not crowding out other funding areas.
Okay, so unfortunately we are running out of time. But before we do so, what would be your parting shots, and generally what would be then your advice to the people of Zimbabwe now that we're headed towards 2023 elections? So what would be your general advice to the stakeholders as the people of Zimbabwe?
Okay, I think that the first thing is that we are having this discussion in a month where SADC says they are having a campaign against sanctions. I think it's important to discuss that with the context of our public finances. You know the U.S. Congress is a complex animal, which we all don't know how it operates, and we shouldn't really care much because it's a sovereign nation in as much as it's also a sovereign. But things that we really understand is how our money is being spent. So I think our primary focus as a nation should not be on the foreign policy of another nation. nation. But our primary focus should be on our own resources. How do we ensure that we manage our resources for the benefit of the collective interests of our own people? And every citizen should be seized with the issue of accountability at every level of society, be it when you are engaging your local authority at council level. Let's not be apathetic to the issue of public finances. It affects us in a big way. Now, that is why we have these deals like the Pomona deal, where residents lose out, but individuals make a lot of money. So I'm urging citizens to really get interested in how their finances are being managed at a national level. How much is being borrowed? How is it being spent? What is happening to the revenue we are collecting every month, every year? That should be an important task for every citizen, not just for a few. But secondly, when elections come, I think it's always an opportunity for people to make decisions. In every society, really, the mindset of a society, you can see it in their leadership. If citizens are so glad that the current government is giving them the best, then we can see them re-electing them in the next election. But if they feel that they are being shortchanged, I think an election presents it a unique opportunity to reconfigure the governance architecture of our nation, and people should take it seriously, register to vote, and make sure they participate in their numbers. And for me, coming from labor and education, I know the teachers and other citizens are clear that they are tired with how these resources are being looted. They are tired with how this nation is being mismanaged, and they would want a new. Unfortunately, it's not up to the teachers alone to make such a decision. It is for the collective to make a decision. But then obviously, thirdly, the last issue would then be for those who are in power at the moment to realize that when we go to the election, elections should not be turned into a season of war. Zimbabwe should not degenerate into a war zone because people just want to vote. We've seen the escalation of political violence because people are drunk with power. They are so obsessed with the power preservation ahead of anything and everything. It is very dangerous for our society, and they won't be, even if they are going to rig and remain in power, if they are going to use this uncouth means to remain in power, they will have difficulties to run the nation, because if you don't have a social contract with the government, it is always difficult for you to then manage the affairs of the nation, because people are always locked in conflict, and a nation locked in conflict can never develop.
True. Thank you very much, Comrade Obert. That was Obert Masarure, everybody, the president of the Amalgamated Rural Teachers Union of Zimbabwe. I'm Liam Kanenga, your host, and this was Kapoto 360 podcast, where we discussed issues to do with public finance management in relation to transparency and accountability in education financing. The gaps have been illuminated as the encroachment of the executive, the weakness of the legal framework, poor prioritization, underutilization, as well as dishonesty in accounting for how finances were spent. So with that, see you next week.